Darkness swallowed the sky in the middle of the day. The ground moaned beneath the weight of what was unfolding, as though the earth itself might tear apart at any moment. In that single breath of time, the world stepped past a threshold from which there would be no return. Upon a hill ignored by earthly rulers, yet forever marked in the memory of heaven and dreaded by the depths of hell, a man hung suspended between sky and soil. Rejected by humanity, forsaken by those closest to him, he remained silent before cruelty, and yet he continued to pour himself out for everyone. His flesh had been ripped open. Every breath he drew was a fight. Every beat of his heart was an offering. Still, something remained in his gaze that no weapon could touch, a radiance that cut straight through the surrounding blackness. And when the final breath escaped from his lips, the unthinkable took place. The great curtain was ripped apart, burial places burst open, and the ancient stillness of the temple was shattered by the thunder of eternity breaking through. But what happened after that? What came after the death of the one whose life split all of history into two halves? When noon arrived, the sky did more than grow dim. It dressed itself in sorrow. This was no common shadow. It was a suffocating blanket of blackness that draped over Jerusalem like a verdict spoken without words. The atmosphere grew dense, hard to breathe, as though the entire world had stopped inhaling, waiting for what was taking place. Thunder rolled across the heavens, though no lightning flashed. At the summit of Golgotha, a wooden cross stood as both an ending and a beginning. Jesus was losing blood, drop by drop. His frame hung limp from exhaustion. His mouth could barely form sounds, yet his presence overwhelmed everything around him. The Roman soldiers nearby whispered among themselves. Not one of them laughed. Not one threw an insult. Terror had crept into every battle-worn face among them. The centurion, a warrior conditioned to dismiss suffering, felt a chill crawl up his back. He had watched countless men breathe their last, but never had he seen anyone die like this, with such command, such willing surrender, such clear intention. The centurion murmured to himself, this man is nothing like the others." Down at the base of the cross, the women shed tears without making a sound. Their tears fell gently, weakly. John stood close by, struggling to hold himself together while his entire world fell apart before his eyes. Then a deep and heavy quiet settled over the scene, and with a voice that was frail yet carried the weight of holy thunder, Jesus declared, "It is finished." His body gave way, his head dropped forward, and the earth answered back. At that exact moment inside the Temple of Jerusalem, the priests were in the middle of preparing the evening incense. Everything was proceeding according to custom, the same ritual performed countless times before, until the floor shook violently under their sandals. A wind that should not have existed rushed into the sacred space. The fabric hangings whipped wildly, the torch flames bent sideways. And then came the sound, the veil, that sacred barrier separating the holiest chamber, the room only the high priest could enter just once each year, was torn in two from the top all the way down to the bottom. No human hands did this, no blade touched it. This was the work of heaven's own power. The priests let out screams. Some collapsed face first onto the floor. Others ran away in terror. The barrier that had stood between God and mankind for generations had just been torn apart. Something holy, something that had remained untouched through the ages, now lay split open from the heights of heaven down to the dust of the earth. Beyond the temple walls, fierce winds bent the palm trees nearly to the ground. Rocks tumbled down from the hillsides. Stone walls groaned under the strain, and the impossible kept happening. Burial chambers began to crack. Tombs that had been sealed for ages broke open. The grip of death had been shattered. Disorder spread through the streets of the city, but this was not the disorder of battle. This was the disorder that comes just before glory reveals itself. Back at Golgotha, after the ground had trembled, after the sky had turned black, after watching Jesus take his final breath, the centurion dropped to his knees. His eyes, once filled with doubt, now burned with holy fear. He cried out, "Without question, this man was the Son of God." His words carried through the ranks of soldiers. Many bowed their heads, unsure how to process what they had witnessed. Others just stood there, frozen in silence. The cross, now still and quiet, seemed to radiate a presence that no one could put into words. But the supernatural signs did not end there. Fissures split the ground open. Tombs scattered across the city started to collapse inward. Long-forgotten graves broke apart like clay jars dropped from a height. Stone markers crumbled to pieces. Bones that had turned to dust now came together again. Muscle formed over bone. Skin wrapped around muscle. Life returned where only silence had reigned. Those who had died holding on to faith were coming back. On the eastern hillside, a young child pointed and spoke with a shaking voice. "Mommy, someone is coming up out of the ground." Figures appeared among the olive groves. Men and women wearing clothes covered in dirt. Their eyes blazed with light. Their steps were steady and sure. They made no sound. They walked in the direction of the holy city. They moved, not as phantoms, but as living proof, as messengers of what was still to come. The gates of Jerusalem swung open from the force of the quake. Some of the guards ran away in panic. Others sank to their knees. The guards shouted, "What is happening here?" Out in the fields, shepherds let their staffs fall from their hands. Inside the homes, candles flickered out though no wind blew. On the flat rooftops, men stared at the darkened sky with dread in their eyes. In that moment, the world had become something different than it was before. In a valley not far away, a flock of goats ran in wild circles, as though escaping from something no human eye could perceive. Their hooves struck the parched ground and kicked up clouds of dust, while their wide-open eyes revealed a primal kind of fear. The shepherds called out, trying to bring them back together, but nothing worked. Something unseen had disrupted the natural order of all creation. Up in the sky, birds that normally glided with ease now flew without direction, flapping their wings with no purpose, as though the currents of air had lost their way. Some dropped from the sky without warning. Others circled aimlessly, bewildered, as if the very concepts of rising and falling had been scrambled. Then stillness arrived. Not simply the absence of sound, but a thick, weighty, sacred stillness. A stillness that meant something had been recognized. A stillness that signaled something had shifted forever. It was as though every living creature cried out without uttering a word. The Lamb had been killed. Inside the palace of Herod, all the wealth and splendor could not push back the fear. Servants lost their grip on golden cups. The crash of shattering glass rang through the stone hallways. One servant sprinted through the ornate chambers, gripped by panic, shouting, "The city has gone dark!" But even as he spoke, his own voice shook. He understood. They all understood. This was far more than a storm. Elsewhere throughout the city, people remained flat on the ground in the streets, some on their knees, others clutching their children close, all of them struggling to make sense of what they had just experienced. Some whispered about divine punishment. Others talked of a curse falling upon them. Hardly anyone, almost no one at all, grasped that this was the most sacred day the world had ever known. The massive columns of the temple groaned as though they might topple, yet they held firm. The altar stood unharmed, but now it held no power within it, because the sacrifice that truly mattered was no longer offered on cold stone. It had been offered in living flesh. Even in the unseen realm, Even in places beyond what human eyes can observe, dark spirits shuddered with fear. Right then, a brand new era had begun, and everything that would unfold in the days ahead was merely the start. 3 days went by. The body of Jesus had been buried in haste, wrapped in burial cloth, laid inside a tomb that belonged to another man, and sealed behind a massive stone. There had been no opportunity for proper honors, no chance for goodbyes, only urgency, fear, and quiet. The city was still buzzing with talk of the signs, the torn curtain, the blackened sky, the violent shaking of the ground. Something had shifted in the atmosphere, in the land, in the hearts of the people. Even though few could name exactly what it was, unease lingered everywhere. In a concealed chamber of the Sanhedrin, the religious authorities came together in a rush. Torchlight threw unsteady shadows against the walls. Their expressions were strained, their voices hushed but loaded with alarm. One of the leaders spoke. "We must silence this before it spirals out of control." Another added, "The followers may try to take the body. They will claim he rose from the dead. They will say the ancient words have come true." The decision was made. Then turn that tomb into a place no one can breach. No one gets in, no one gets out. The command rang out. "Soldiers, seal it with the emperor's mark. No entry, no exit." At that same hour, in a different part of the city, Mary, the mother of Jesus, stood gazing out her window at the sky. The clouds that had blanketed Jerusalem were now gone. Blue had returned overhead, but her spirit remained wrapped in fog. Her heart beat with a sense of something approaching that she could not explain. Something was on its way, something immense, something sacred, even through all the agony. In the meantime, the disciples stayed hidden away. Doors were bolted shut. Words were spoken barely above a whisper. Their eyes showed exhaustion. Terror had taken complete hold of them. Without their teacher, the calling they had followed seemed to have reached its end. One of the disciples whispered, "He is gone. But what if he comes back?" Peter just shook his head without saying anything. His stare was empty. The weight of his denial still pressed down on him. Shame had crushed whatever hope remained. As the quiet of night settled in, Jerusalem made an effort to go back to normal. Vendors set up their booths once more. Soldiers returned to their stations. But the echoes of what happened on that cross still pulsed through the stones of the city. Nothing had truly returned to normal. Nothing ever would again. And then, on the third day, as the morning sun began its gentle climb above the edge of the world, an entirely new chapter was about to begin. The third day arrived, cloaked in a stillness unlike any other. The paving stones of the streets still showed the damage from the earthquake that had rattled Jerusalem to its core. The morning air felt gentle, carrying the softness of early spring. Yet within that breeze lingered something unseen, something sacred, a feeling of anticipation, as though the skies above were holding their breath in expectation. Mary Magdalene moved swiftly down the narrow trail that wound toward the burial site. She carried linens in her arms, carefully prepared with fragrant oils. Inside her chest, a fierce ache of longing burned. Following close behind her, other women walked without speaking. The redness around their eyes revealed they had spent the entire night in tears. Even so, their feet moved with purpose. The wound of loss was still raw, but something even more powerful than sorrow drove them forward. It was love. As they drew nearer, the garden slowly emerged in the pale glow of early morning. Shadows melted away little by little beneath the branches of the trees. When they finally reached the massive rock that had blocked the entrance to the tomb, a wave of cold washed over them. The stone had been moved. The women asked one another, "Who rolled the stone away? And what about the soldiers? Where have the guards gone?" The opening before them seemed to give off a soft, barely visible glow, rising up from somewhere deep within the darkness. Mary Magdalene moved closer. Her hands shook uncontrollably. Her heart pounded wildly inside her ribs. It felt as though the entire world had stopped breathing alongside her. With careful movements, she pulled back the fabric that hung at the entrance. The tomb held nothing inside. The other women looked at each other, gripped by a fear they could not voice. The burial cloths lay there, neatly folded, completely undisturbed. But the body was gone. A strange and impossible emptiness hung in that stone chamber. It was not merely the absence of a corpse, it was the absence of death altogether. Without warning, a brilliant light exploded from within the rock walls, as if the gates of heaven had swung open from beneath the ground. The women stumbled backward by instinct, lifting their arms to shield their faces, their hearts slamming against their chests. The radiance did not scorch them, but it overwhelmed every sense they had. And there, standing at the center of that blazing light, two figures took shape. Their robes shone like bolts of lightning, their faces veiled by pure glory. When they opened their mouths to speak, their words carried not just sound, but authority. The angels declared, "Why are you searching for the living among those who are dead? He is not in this place. He has risen from death, just as he told you he would." Those words crashed into the hearts of the women like rolling thunder. Fear and wonder tangled together inside them. The heaviness of grief began to lift, replaced by something words could never capture. They sank to their knees on the cold floor of the tomb. That ground, once ordinary stone, now felt like holy earth. Mary Magdalene shook from the top of her head to the soles of her feet, but the despair had drained from her eyes. Something brand new was taking root inside her. It was faith. The heavenly beings continued, "Go now and bring this news to the disciples. Tell them he is already on his way to Galilee ahead of them. That is where they will see him with their own eyes." The quiet that had blanketed the garden shattered under the sound of rushing footsteps. The women hurried out of the tomb, caught somewhere between sobbing and laughing. Tears still streamed down their cheeks, yet they ran with the energy of people carrying life itself in their hands. For the first time since the horror of the cross, hope had returned. Back in the city, the Roman guards slowly started coming back to their senses. A few of them still lay flat on the ground, dazed, completely unable to make sense of what had happened. A light had blazed down from the sky. The earth had split apart at the break of dawn, and the enormous stone had been moved without a single human hand touching it. Overwhelmed with panic, they rushed to find the religious authorities. The guards stammered out their report. The body is gone. How could it vanish? There was a light, some kind of being. We collapsed. When we opened our eyes again, the stone had already been rolled away. The council of the Sanhedrin assembled without delay. Every face had gone pale. Every voice was tight with tension. The danger was undeniable. Word of a resurrection could sweep through the region like wildfire across dry brush. The leaders gave their orders. "Not a word of this to anyone. You will tell people that his followers snuck in during the night and carried off the body while you were asleep." One guard protested. "But what happens if the Romans discover we fell asleep on duty?" The reply came quickly. "We will handle Rome. You will be generously compensated for your silence." At the same time, the disciples remained in hiding, huddled behind locked doors, barely daring to breathe. The room was thick with dread, with guilt, with heartache. The promise their master had made felt impossibly far away now. Then, without any warning, the door flew open. Mary Magdalene rushed inside, breathless. The disciples said to her, "Mary, you look shaken. What has happened?" She answered them, I saw him with my very own eyes. He spoke words to me. He called me by my name." Peter and John stared at one another. Something ignited deep within them. Neither one spoke a single word. They simply bolted out the door. They sprinted through the winding streets. They raced through the garden paths. They ran all the way to the tomb. When they got there, they found the burial linens arranged with care. There was no evidence of any struggle, no indication of robbery. Peter understood. This was not the work of thieves. Whatever had happened here was something far, far greater. Later that same evening, while the disciples were still gathered together behind barred doors, consumed by confusion, the atmosphere in the room shifted in an instant. No door had swung open. No window had budged even slightly. Yet there he stood among them. Jesus spoke softly. "Peace be with you." Eyes flew wide open. Hearts nearly burst from their chests. Some of them dropped to the floor. Some broke down weeping. Others pulled back in terror. But it was truly him. He was alive. Jesus said to them, "Look at my hands. Touch them and see for yourselves. A ghost does not have flesh and bone the way I do." Over the following days, Thomas listened to every account the others shared, but he refused to accept it. Thomas declared, "Unless I see the wounds left by the nails with my own eyes, unless I place my fingers inside them, I will never believe." 8 days came and went. Once again, all of them had gathered in one place. The doors were shut tight. Every heart was fully alert. And just like before, Jesus appeared right there in the middle of them. He looked at Thomas and said, "Put your finger right here. Look closely at my hands. Stop doubting and start believing." Thomas collapsed to his knees, weeping, and cried out, "My Lord and my God." Jesus gazed at him with deep tenderness. Then Jesus replied, "You believe now because your eyes have seen me. But there is a greater blessing waiting for those who believe without ever having seen." Those words lingered in the room long after Jesus had gone. And as the days passed, the power of the resurrection spread wider with each sunrise. The disciples slowly began to grasp the bigger picture. The purpose behind everything was larger than the cross itself. Death had not been the conclusion. It had been the doorway. But beyond that small circle of believers, the rest of the world remained blind to the truth. Throughout Jerusalem, whispers multiplied. Some people laughed it off. Others questioned whether any of it could be real. But a few began to put their trust in what they heard. Yet for the disciples, the whispers of the city mattered little. They had received a command, and they intended to follow it. And so they left Jerusalem behind and journeyed north, climbing up into the highlands of Galilee, making their way toward a meeting place their master had chosen. A fresh era was preparing to break through. Something was descending from the heavens above, something that would transform absolutely everything. Galilee stretched out before them with its rolling hills and sun-drenched fields, breathing out an air of stillness. But inside the hearts of the disciples, anticipation churned alongside nervousness and fragile hope. Every stride they took up that mountainside, guided by the words their teacher had spoken, was loaded with memories, with unanswered questions, with lingering fear. He had given them his word that he would meet them in this place, so they came. When they reached the summit, the breeze was soft, the sky was crystal clear, and the quiet felt different somehow. It was not long before he appeared. Jesus stood before them, alive, radiant with glory, wearing the same expression that had once captivated fishermen, transformed sinners, and silenced rulers. They fell to the ground on their knees, not merely out of reverence, but because that moment seemed to rip open the curtain separating heaven from earth. Some stood frozen in wonder, unable to move a muscle. Others let tears slide silently down their faces. Every single one of them, though, wore the same look in their eyes, the realization that they were standing in the presence of something no human words could ever fully express. The wind sweeping over those hills carried an ancient sound, almost as if all of creation had gone quiet to hear what was about to be spoken. Then Jesus opened his mouth, and every syllable he uttered seemed to vibrate with the weight of countless generations, as though all of heaven exhaled along with him. Jesus proclaimed, "All authority has been handed to me, both in heaven and across the earth. Therefore, go out and make followers of every nation, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." Those words pierced their hearts like arrows made of pure light. Some of the disciples shut their eyes, desperate to carve that voice permanently into their memories. Others scanned the horizon, picturing the impossible, imagining distant tribes hearing this message, envisioning cities not yet built being reshaped by its power. It was as though the edges of the world had suddenly stretched wider than ever before. Jesus continued and promised, "And know this, I am with you every single day without fail." The force of those words seemed to send a tremor through the very air around them. There, on that peaceful hillside, the mission came to life. It was not delivered as a simple instruction, but ignited like flames racing through dry grass, an unstoppable calling that towered above every other purpose, greater even than time itself. Yet one piece was still missing from the picture. Just before departing with the calm assurance of one who holds mastery over both life and forever, Jesus added, "Stay in Jerusalem and wait there until you are wrapped in power sent down from the heights of heaven." The disciples traded uncertain glances. They did not fully comprehend what lay ahead, but they chose to trust. They placed their faith in him, because the one speaking these words had already defeated the grave. And then it happened. Jesus began to rise. Without warning, his feet lifted off the ground as though the pull of the earth no longer had any claim on him. A light began to grow around him, warm and alive, and too brilliant to stare at for more than a moment. At last, a cloud filled with glory came down and wrapped itself around him, hiding him from their sight, as though the heavens themselves were welcoming their king back home. The disciples stood frozen in place, their hearts split between awe and an aching desire for him to stay. The hush that followed ran so deep that even the sound of their own breathing seemed to echo across the mountaintop. Then two figures appeared standing beside them, clothed in robes of dazzling white, as if they had stepped straight out of the cloud itself. They spoke with voices that carried the weight of heaven. "You who come from Galilee, why do you keep staring up at the sky? This very same Jesus, who has just been lifted up from your midst, will return one day in exactly the manner you watched him leave." Those words seared themselves into the depths of their hearts. He was coming back. It was a twofold promise that would echo through eternity. The journey back to Jerusalem moved at a slow and reverent pace. Not a single person dared to break the silence. Every footprint left in the dust felt like a marker for an entirely new chapter unfolding across the universe. The world itself had been transformed, and so had each one of them. Once they reached the city, they climbed the stairs to the upper room. There they came together like a single burning flame, lifting prayers, shedding tears, and waiting. Time itself seemed to hang motionless in that space. None of them could say how long they would remain, yet every one of them understood exactly who they were expecting. The days stretched on. Beyond those walls, Jerusalem hummed with activity. The festival of Pentecost had arrived. Travelers from distant lands packed the narrow streets. Merchants called out to passers-by. Dozens of different languages blended together like streams pouring into a single river. No one walking through that bustling city, not a single soul, could have guessed that they were about to witness the birth of something that would last forever. On the 50th day, While the early morning still wrapped Jerusalem in quiet, the heavens let out a roar. This was no far-off rumble of thunder. This was no ordinary gust blown in from the east. This was something altogether different, something that seemed to rise not from the outside world, but from life itself, breathing directly into the ground. Then, without warning, a sound exploded through the air, a noise like a violent storm, powerful enough to split mountains apart. That roar flooded every corner of the house where they had gathered. No crack in the walls, no hidden space escaped that wind, a wind that did not scatter dust but shook the very core of their beings. The walls themselves pulsed as though answering a summons spoken before time began. The air twisted and churned, alive with something that no word could fully name. And then they appeared. Flames descended, but these were not ordinary flames. They did not consume. They did not injure. They did not destroy. They were living lights, tongues of fire that settled gently upon each person like small crowns being placed on their heads. The warmth that rushed through their bodies did not scorch their flesh. Instead, it burned away every trace of fear. It unlocked something holy that had been waiting inside them. And then everything changed. Words began pouring out of their mouths in an unstoppable flood. These were not phrases they had memorized. These were languages they had never once spoken or even heard before. Their very breath transformed into prayer. Their voices became instruments of prophecy. The upper room could no longer contain the force that had been unleashed. Each disciple felt himself gripped by a power that seemed to weave heaven and earth together within his own chest. Everything that had once been hesitation had now become raw courage. Everything that had once been fear had now become fearless boldness. The men who had cowered behind locked doors now walked forward like lions set free from chains, like carriers of a flame that nothing could ever snuff out. The crowds who had gathered for the feast began to swarm toward the sound, pulled in by the shouts, the noise, the unexplainable energy radiating from that place. People from every corner of the known world stood there in shock. They exclaimed, "We are Parthians, Medes, and people from lands scattered across the earth, yet every one of us can hear these men declaring the mighty works of God in our own native tongue." Some watched in stunned amazement, but others laughed and hurled insults. It was right then that Peter rose to his feet. This was the same man who had denied knowing his master not once, not twice, but 3 times. This was the same man who had been crushed under a weight of guilt heavy enough to silence any leader. Yet now he stood tall. His voice carried no hint of a tremor. His eyes blazed with the very fire that had just rested on his head. Peter lifted his voice and proclaimed, "Men of Judea and everyone living in Jerusalem, hear what I have to say. These men standing before you are not drunk. It is only 9 o'clock in the morning. No, what you are witnessing is exactly what the prophet Joel spoke about long ago." The crowd went completely still. The silence was so thick that even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. Peter spoke as though another voice was speaking through him. He opened the ancient writings and laid out the plan God had been weaving since the dawn of time. He revealed the Messiah who had been nailed to a cross and then raised back to life, and he did so with the certainty of a man who had watched death itself bow in defeat. Every sentence landed like a hammer striking stone, cracking open hearts that had grown hard. Peter declared, "This Jesus, the one you nailed to the cross, God has raised him up and made him both Lord and the promised Christ." The impact hit instantly. Countless people felt their chests ripped open by a truth they could no longer push away. Voices cried out from the crowd, "Brothers, what are we supposed to do now?" "What can we possibly do?" Peter answered them, not with blame, but with fire and with hope. "Turn away from your old ways. Let each one of you be washed in the waters of baptism in the name of Jesus the Messiah. Your sins will be wiped clean, and you will receive the gift of the Holy Spirit." On that single day, around 3,000 people gave their lives to faith, 3,000 hearts transformed, 3,000 personal histories rewritten from that moment forward, 3,000 new flames ignited, and those flames would spread across the land like wildfire tearing through an open field. And just like that, in the dust of a Jerusalem street, surrounded by bewildered crowds and the echo of foreign tongues, the church was born. It did not emerge inside royal palaces. It did not begin within marble temples built by powerful hands. It sprang up in the streets, inside shattered hearts, surrounded by heavenly fire. And from that day on, the disciples began living as true brothers and sisters. They broke bread together at the same tables. They lifted their voices together in prayer. They sold what they owned and gave the money to anyone who had need. The bond of love between them deepened and grew like a tree planted along the banks of rivers that never run dry. The mission had been launched. Love became the outward proof of a people set apart, though unseen by the world. They were a people no longer defined by city walls, by inherited customs, or by earthly thrones. They were defined by a fire that blazed inside their souls. And wherever that love took root, miracles began bursting forth like streams rushing through parched and barren land. One afternoon, Peter and John climbed the stone steps that led up to the temple. It was the hour set aside for prayer, and the afternoon sun sparkled against the ancient stonework, casting golden light over the pilgrims, the merchants, and the priests moving through the courtyard. At the entrance known as the Beautiful Gate, just as on countless days before, a man lay stretched out on the ground. He had been crippled since the day he was born. Every morning others would carry him to this spot so he could hold out his trembling hand and beg for coins to survive another day. But on this particular day, something beyond anything he could have dreamed was about to take place. Peter came to a halt directly in front of him and locked eyes with the man. The intensity of that gaze made the beggar's heart pound. Peter commanded, "Turn your eyes toward us." The crippled man lifted his face. His whole life he had grown used to seeing pity reflected in the eyes of those who passed by. He expected a few small coins tossed his way, maybe just enough to buy a scrap of bread. But the look in Peter's eyes held no trace of pity. It held authority. Peter declared, "I do not have silver, I do not have gold, but what I do have, I am giving to you right now. In the name of Jesus Christ from Nazareth, stand up on your feet and walk." Peter stretched out his hand. The man grabbed hold of it without fully understanding why. And in that heartbeat, something surged through his bones, something that felt like fire, like light, like life itself rushing in. He felt his legs shake, then grow stiff, then turn solid and strong as though they had never known weakness. Almost without thinking, he pushed himself upright. Then, like a small child discovering what his body could do, he leaped into the air. He leaped again and again. He danced right there in front of everyone, laughing and weeping all at once, shouting praise to God while a crowd gathered around him, completely stunned by what they were seeing. This was a sign performed in broad daylight. Undeniable, impossible to cover up. The news raced through the city like flames through dry brush. People rushed from every direction to catch a glimpse of the man everyone recognized, the man who now strode forward with long, powerful steps and pure, unbridled joy. The religious authorities tried to silence the apostles, but the fire inside them could not be tamed. The apostles answered, "We have no choice. We cannot stop talking about the things our own eyes have witnessed and our own ears have heard." And they did not stop. Not for a single day. The light blazed brighter through the streets, and as it did, the darkness began to push back. The young church flourished, its numbers swelled, its spiritual power deepened, its faith grew bolder with every passing day. Gatherings sprang up in homes all across the city, prayers echoed down the winding alleyways of Jerusalem, but as the community of believers expanded, the stares from the outside grew colder. Hostile eyes followed them. Threatening glances tracked their movements. The ones in positions of power trembled at the thought of losing their grip. Inside the hallways of the temple and behind the closed doors of the Sanhedrin, quiet whispers hardened into concrete schemes. The religious establishment watched their influence slipping away, and it terrified them. One name in particular had started to rise above the rest, inspiring fear wherever it was spoken. Saul of Tarsus. He was a young Pharisee, brilliant in intellect, fierce in discipline, sharp as the edge of a freshly forged blade. Burning zeal filled his eyes. Commanding authority rang through his voice. And deep within his chest, a hidden torment churned. He had memorized more of the sacred law than most of his teachers, and he despised the name of Jesus with a passion that felt holy to him. In his mind, this new movement was not a work of God. It was an infection that needed to be cut out before it spread any further. But the faith refused to stay quiet. It did not cower. It did not hide itself away. It did not bend under the weight of fear. The Holy Spirit swept through hearts the way wind sweeps through groves of ancient olive trees. The name of the crucified one rang out in the streets, inside private homes, across public squares, and every time it was spoken, the rage of the opposition burned hotter. It was in the middle of this mounting pressure that the first blood was spilled. Stephen, a young man overflowing with wisdom and filled to the brim with the Spirit, stood before the religious council with a boldness no one had ever witnessed before. His face seemed to glow like the face of an angel. His words cut like sharpened blades, like hammers swung against walls of hardened stone. That was more than they could bear. They pressed their hands over their ears, refusing to hear another syllable. Like a mob driven mad, they surged toward him in a human flood. They seized him and dragged him beyond the city walls to a place where the cliffs echoed with the sounds of violence. There, beneath a storm of stones hurled with savage hatred, Stephen lifted his voice one final time, still radiant even in death. He cried out, "Lord, do not count this sin against them." And then his spirit departed. Standing nearby, watching every moment unfold, was Saul. He did not throw a single stone with his own hands, but his heart swelled with approval at the crime. He stood guard over the cloaks the executioners had laid aside. He endorsed every blow, every scream, every rock that struck flesh. But the death of Stephen did not halt the movement. It did the opposite. It set it ablaze. Persecution erupted across the region like a sudden and violent storm. Doors were smashed open as neighbors stood frozen, unable to grasp the fury being unleashed against such a peaceful people. Screams rang through the narrow alleyways. Entire families were torn apart. The name of Jesus, once whispered with deep reverence, had now become a death sentence for anyone bold enough to speak it. But what the enemy designed as scattering, God reshaped into spreading. The Christ followers fled into regions scarred by ancient conflicts, and yet those very lands now opened wide to receive the impossible. Among those who scattered was Philip. He traveled north into Samaria, a land most Jews refused to enter, and there he proclaimed the message without holding back. He placed his hands on the sick and watched them recover. He set free those who had been held captive by dark powers, whose cries had been choked silent for years. Smiles broke out on faces where terror had ruled for as long as anyone could remember. The entire city seemed to inhale hope for the first time in generations. and along a lonely desert road, an Ethiopian official sat inside his elegant chariot, reading aloud from the Hebrew scriptures. Divine timing brought Philip directly to him. Questions tumbled out. Faith took root and blossomed. And when they came upon a body of water in the middle of that barren wilderness, they climbed down from the chariot together. The Ethiopian rose up from those waters as a completely new man and journeyed home carrying the message of life with him. That single moment planted a seed, and in the centuries that followed, that seed would cross borders no empire had ever dared to challenge. Meanwhile, Saul of Tarsus burned with more fury than ever before. He set his face toward Damascus and began the march. The documents he gripped in his fists were far more than official permissions. They were instruments of destruction. A fire blazed inside his chest, driving him to wipe out this new movement once and for all. To Saul, this was not merely an assignment, it was a holy war. It was sacred obligation. It was a contract sworn to the law he worshipped. But somewhere along that dusty road, heaven stepped into his path. A light more brilliant than the sun, more pure, more overwhelming than anything this world had ever produced, crashed down upon him. Saul was thrown to the ground as though his very pride had been ripped out by the roots. He could not fight back. He could not form a single argument. There was only blinding glory. A voice thundered from somewhere beyond the sky. "Saul, Saul, why are you hunting me down?" That voice did not merely reach his ears. It shook through his stomach, pierced into his soul, echoed through every memory he had ever carried, and touched every wound he had tried to hide. His whole body trembling, Saul managed to stammer out the words, "Who are you, Lord?" The reply came like a thunderclap, wrapped in undeserved kindness. "I am Jesus, the one you are persecuting." Then the light vanished, the vision faded away, and with it all the arrogance drained out of him. Suddenly blind and utterly helpless, the man who had terrorized entire communities now had to depend on the hands of strangers just to take a single step. He was guided into Damascus, where he spent the following days submerged in total silence, refusing food and wrestling with deep remorse. His thoughts churned without rest. His heart felt like it was bleeding out. His very soul seemed to collapse inward. But even then, God was already setting the next part of the plan into motion. On the far side of the city, a humble believer named Ananias, a man who paid close attention to the whispers of the Spirit, received a direct command from heaven. Terror gripped him and made his hands shake. The reputation of Saul had spread across the entire region like a dark cloud, yet the voice of God rang louder than any fear. Ananias walked into the house where Saul sat motionless, trapped like a prisoner inside his own broken body. He stepped closer. He drew in a long breath. Then he spoke the words that would shatter the final wall, standing inside Saul's heart. Ananias said gently, "Saul, brother, the Lord himself has sent me to you." The moment Ananias placed his hands upon him, something that looked like fish scales crumbled away from Saul's eyes. His physical sight flooded back. But that was not all that returned. His soul came rushing back to life. His sense of purpose returned. His entire existence was made new. He had been completely and utterly transformed. Within just a few days, the very man who had hunted down believers was now proclaiming the faith with a boldness that could only come from heaven. Saul declared openly, "Jesus is the Son of God." Shock rippled through the city. The religious authorities stood speechless. The common people found themselves split down the middle, and those who had once stood with Saul now stared at him with widening eyes, feeling a brand new kind of dread. The name of Saul had become a threat, but no longer to the followers of Jesus. Now it was a threat to the ones doing the oppressing. The hunter was rapidly becoming the most powerful voice for the hunted, but safety had slipped beyond his reach. His old companions, unable to stomach such a dramatic reversal, started weaving plots against him. The open streets turned into snares. The shadowed alleyways became places where danger lurked at every turn. His former allies whispered among themselves, "Saul must be killed." Then, under the cover of a moonless night, his new brothers in the faith led him to the outer wall of the city. They rigged together a makeshift basket. Coarse ropes were tied with trembling fingers, not shaking from fear, but from the weight of what they were doing. Saul climbed inside that basket. He tilted his head upward. Above him, he saw the faces of men who just days earlier would have run in terror at the sight of him. Now those same men were risking everything they had to keep him alive. Slowly, they lowered him down the side of the wall, through the black of night, carried along by grace. The moment his feet landed on the ground outside, the old version of his life had been left behind forever. His new calling was only just getting started, but when he reached Jerusalem, the welcome he received was anything but warm. The disciples still carried deep suspicion in their hearts. The stories of the persecutor were still too fresh. Doors cracked open only enough to let a sliver of light through. Wary eyes tracked his every move. Then Barnabas stepped forward. He was a man with a wide-open heart, a tender voice, and eyes that were always watching for where God was moving. He stood at Saul's side and spoke up for him. He put his own name on the line to confirm that the transformation was real. And so, slowly, cautiously, step by step, the man who had once been feared as an enemy was embraced as a brother. But outside those small gatherings, the hunt did not slow down. If anything, it grew fiercer, like a storm drawing strength as it tears across open water. Fear crept through the streets of Jerusalem. Whole families bolted their doors and refused to come out. Rumors traveled from rooftop to rooftop, from doorway to doorway. Soldiers marched through the city with urgent purpose. Religious officials huddled in secret meetings. Every corner seemed to conceal some fresh danger waiting to strike. The powers of darkness churned like a furious ocean, desperate to swallow up the small flame growing among the disciples. But nothing, absolutely nothing in heaven or on earth, could extinguish what had been ignited from above. The hand of heaven had reached down and touched the dust of this world. No human force, no political scheme, no spiritual assault would ever be able to reverse it. Because wherever blood was spilled, new life sprang up. Wherever chains were locked, songs of praise rang out. Wherever crosses were raised, salvation burst into bloom. The faith they tried to stamp out multiplied like seeds flung into the wind. And then the summons arrived. In the city of Antioch, a crossroads where nations collided and commerce and cultures swirled together, the church came together for a time of fasting and earnest prayer. The atmosphere in that room pressed down heavy, as though the very air might split open at any moment. Hushed voices rose and fell. Tears streamed down faces. Pleas were lifted to heaven. And then, right there in the middle of that gathering of surrendered hearts, the Spirit of God spoke with a clarity so sharp that no one present could question it. The Spirit commanded, "Set Barnabas and Saul apart for me. I have a specific work for them to do." The instruction was simple in its words, yet staggering in its scope, and they obeyed without hesitation. They packed only the essentials and walked out the door, placing their full confidence in the truth that the same God who issues the call also provides for the journey. And with every step they took, the axis on which the entire world spun began shifting in a new direction. Cyprus, Pisidia, Lystra, Iconium. 4 names that represented 4 entirely different worlds. Cities soaked in pagan worship, ancient gathering places where the law of Moses was read aloud, roads choked with dust, mountains baked dry under a relentless sun, marketplaces overflowing with voices speaking foreign tongues. Yet in every place they travelled, they discovered hearts dying of thirst for something real. In every city, miracles erupted that left crowds shaking in astonishment. In every city, fierce opposition rose up trying to choke out the message. In every city, lives hung in the balance between belief and rejection. In Lystra, when they restored strength to a man who had never taken a single step in his entire life, the crowd lost all sense of reason. They convinced themselves that gods from the old myths had come down to walk among mortals. They called Barnabas by the name Zeus. They called Paul by the name Hermes. Villagers rushed forward carrying garlands of flowers and oxen to be slaughtered as offerings. But the apostles grabbed their own robes and ripped them apart, refusing to accept even a shred of the glory. The reversal came as fast as a bolt of lightning. That same crowd flipped from wild enthusiasm to murderous rage, and Paul was pelted with stones until he collapsed. His body lay crumpled in the dirt, smeared with dust and blood. Many who looked on muttered that he was finished. But when the other believers gathered around his motionless form, he pushed himself back to his feet. He rose like a man who understood deep in his bones that death does not get the final word. He did not stand out of arrogance. He did not stand out of stubborn will. He stood because the message he carried no longer belonged only to the descendants of Israel. People from every nation were hearing. People from every background were believing. People who had never known the God of Abraham were now celebrating the truth that had broken their chains. The kingdom of heaven was smashing through barriers that not even the mightiest Roman legion had ever breached. As the journeys continued, a question surfaced that threatened to tear the young faith apart at the seams. Were the new converts required to observe every detail of the ancient law of Moses? The leaders gathered in Jerusalem to settle the matter. Peter stood and shared what he had witnessed. James weighed the evidence carefully. Paul gave his testimony of what God had done among the outsiders, and the Spirit of God guided every word that was spoken, steering them toward a decision that would reverberate across the coming centuries. Salvation does not come through keeping traditions. It does not come through performing rituals. It does not come through family bloodlines or personal achievements. It comes through faith, faith alone. With that declaration, a doorway swung wide open before every nation on the face of the earth, and Paul pressed forward, fueled by an unquenchable sense of purpose. In the city of Philippi, a pitch-black prison cell became the setting for an extraordinary miracle. The ground shook, doors flew open, chains snapped apart, yet not a single prisoner escaped. What was set free that night was not a criminal, it was the heart of an entire household. In Thessalonica, accusers dragged Paul before the authorities and charged him with turning the whole world upside down. And the charge was accurate. In Athens, he went toe-to-toe with the greatest intellectuals of the age, the philosophers and deep thinkers who had shaped the culture of the entire ancient world. Standing among stone altars and towering statues of false gods, he announced the existence of a God they did not yet know, a God who is alive and who lacks nothing. In Corinth, he lifted up the call to purity in the midst of rampant moral corruption. In Ephesus, his teaching struck such a blow to the idol-making industry that riots broke out and nearly burned the city to the ground. Yet none of it knocked him off course. His eyes remained fixed on one final destination, Rome, the beating heart of the empire, the seat of the Caesars, the political and spiritual nerve center of the known world. He did not enter that city as a celebrated hero. He arrived as a captive, wrists bound in chains, soldiers flanking him on every side. His body was confined, but his voice could never be caged. From inside that Roman prison, he wrote words drenched in light, words that would travel across centuries, letters that would mold entire systems of belief, reshape congregations, and influence empires. messages that would cause the proud to kneel and give the enslaved the courage to dream. And when his race was nearly run, he left behind a declaration that still echoes through time. Paul wrote, "I have fought the good fight. I have crossed the finish line. I have held tightly to the faith." Rome made every effort to silence him. The empire tried to muzzle the message with the edge of the sword, with official decrees, with cold dungeon walls. In the end, they severed his head from his body. But they could never silence what spoke through him, because that voice flowed from the eternal realm. Not far from where Paul fell, Peter also sealed his belief with his own blood. He made one request before they executed him, that they nail him to the cross with his head facing downward. He could not accept the honor of dying in the same position as his master. Others followed after them, more martyrs, more unnamed heroes whose stories the world was not worthy to hold. But the faith did not shrink back. It surged forward like a river bursting its banks in the rainy season. It poured through open fields, down cramped alleyways, and into the marble halls of palaces. It transformed hardened Roman soldiers, overlooked slaves, forgotten women, orphaned children, grieving widows, and even members of royal households. The hidden catacombs beneath the city became sacred gathering places. The blood-soaked floor of the Colosseum became a platform for testimonies that still whisper on the wind today, and the cross, once an emblem of disgrace and torment, was lifted high as the ultimate symbol of triumph. The revolution of this kingdom did not advance through the clash of swords. It advanced through the power of sacrificial love. It did not spread through marching armies. It spread through faithful witnesses. It was not built by rulers seated on earthly thrones. It was built by the King of all kings. And from that day forward, the world was never, never the same again.